Our week 9 topic is gender, equality, and inequality. Now, this topic is going to bring together some of the concepts we've already talked about this term. So we've had some issues around, or I shouldn't say issues, but we've discussed some of the issues around equality and inequality and equity in relation to other topics. But now we're going to look at the topic more explicitly and in a lot more detail. And then I'm going to give you several examples that come to us from looking at how labor is divided along the lines of gender. But then we're also going to look at and kind of revisit this issue of representation and some of the risks associated with running for politics and how this plays out along gender lines. And then very briefly, we can talk about some of the economic perspectives as well. So lots of terminology here. Please do review this. Friendly reminder that, of course, you can be populating and updating the course wiki with these definitions. So one of the comments I've gotten about this topic is, why don't we look at this from kind of more of an optimistic perspective? So why don't we talk about equality? And really, my answer for that is kind of, well, it's as much as I would love to talk about equality, the reality is that inequality exists, and all societies have some forms of inequality, and anthropologists have been very interested in this. And in relation to this course, the reality is the majority of what we see is gender inequality, right? Where autonomy and equal rights has been denied to people on the basis of their gender. Another thing I need to comment on is kind of the theoretical framework that is going to guide this discussion that we're going to have around equality and equity, which is that of the intersection of feminism and anthropology. So I take an explicitly intersectional feminist approach to this course, to actually most of my courses, and so it's the guiding principle. And one of the questions that I've had from students in the past is, why do I insist upon talking about feminism versus egalitarianism? So I have some notes below where I kind of explain this a little bit more at length and define some of these terms. But I think the key takeaway is that at its core, intersectional feminism is egalitarianism, or the idea that that all people should have equal access, or not even equal, but equitable, and we'll talk about this in a second, equitable access to things like resources and opportunities and status and power and etc., right? But why I talk about and why I use intersectional feminism versus egalitarianism as a framework is the reality is that the world we operate in is not egalitarian, right? And so what intersectional feminism does is acknowledge and recognize that there are various institutions and structures that cause inequality to occur in the first place, right? So rather than just saying, well, I want to believe and I want everyone to be equal, which I do, what I'm saying is I want everyone to have equitable access to things like power and resources and status, but I have to acknowledge that first and foremost that that's not the case, right? And that often when we start to talk about egalitarianism, we're talking about it from a position of privilege. And so that's why the intersectionality is really important as well, right? So it allows us to understand that inequity is not simply a function or a product of acknowledging differences that exist in gender, but we also have to consider things like class and ethnicity and religion. And of course, one of our other themes for this class, age. So all of these different aspects factor into our understanding of why does inequity exist or inequality exist. And so then I wanted to show you some of these graphics, because I'm sure you've encountered them in social media, that illustrate some of these concepts that I've just introduced you. So the difference between equality versus equity. So for example, when I design my course, I try to design my course as an equitable one, or what we'd call an accessible or an inclusive one, right? One where individuals do not require individual supports or accommodations, because the idea is that I'm going to remove the systemic barriers that exist that might prevent a student from succeeding or excelling in this course, right? Where an equality-based approach says that, well, everyone should have the same supports, everyone should be treated equally. And in theory, again, this sounds like a great idea that we should treat everyone equally, but we can't, right? Because the reality is that, again, because of how inequality works, and because of how oppression works, we have to acknowledge that some people need more than just simply an equitable arrangement, right? Another way that an equal arrangement. One of the other ways that we often explain this is by looking at things like fruit or food resources, right? That with equality, the idea is that, well, everyone would have equally or evenly distributed tools and assistance in order to obtain resources. But as you can see here, the problem with this approach is that some people can then access those resources easier, and then our individual over here, even though they have the exact same support, right, the same tools, they're not able to access the fruit on this tree, right, are not able to access those resources because of the unequal distribution of those resources that's led the tree to tilt in this particular way. So what equity says is that, again, that we should customize some of these tools that identify and address inequality, right? So in this case, we've given this individual here on the right a slightly taller ladder, which allows them to reach the fruit that's on their side. But again, from a contemporary intersectional feminist perspective, we're even saying that, even addressing inequities isn't enough, that really what we should do is get to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is not how tall people's ladders are or whether or not they have equal access to tools, but the very fact that there, again, are systems and institutions that are in place that create this inequity in the first place. So if we fix the system, so in this case, if we straighten out the tree, we encourage and nurture the tree to grow in a way that it's covered in apples, then that way it ensures that everyone has equal access, not just to tools and resources, but also to the opportunities, right? So in this case, they're able to use the same baskets, they're able to use the same ladders because now the tree has been corrected, the apples have been straightened, right? The apples have been distributed throughout it out, and our individuals here can both access the food resources that they need. So along with that, what do we mean when we start to talk about things like institutions and structures that are part of these kind of oppressive networks, or these networks or these systems that create inequity and inequality in our society? Well, colonialism is a big one, right? And colonialism, one that has been driven largely by white men, right? And so there's been some really great studies that have been done, for example, looking at universal design and how the reason why we need universal design is that we live in a world that has been largely built by and designed for men. So I have this Guardian article that talks about this a little bit more, about how crash test dummies, for example, the template for them was based on what was considered to be the average height and weight and build of a middle-aged white guy. And while that means that the safety measures that were developed in cars are great for a middle-aged, average height, average weight, white guy, it does not work for everyone, right? And so again, if we think about this in terms of equality and equity, that one of the measures we've taken, of course, is we've developed child restraints and safety devices that we can use for individuals who have smaller bodies, right? But what about other body forms, right? So seatbelts in particular is something that can be quite contentious, is that depending on your body form, seatbelts may not be not only comfortable, but they actually could be dangerous. And this isn't me saying that you shouldn't wear seatbelts. It's better to wear a seatbelt that fits you poorly than to not wear one. But it's just this idea that we have to think about this, right? For whom are we designing seatbelts for, right? One of the reasons for this is not just colonialism, which we'll talk about in a second, but is also how, again, if we think about last week's topic and socialization, about how we socialize young boys and young girls towards particular career trajectories. So we talked last week about how a lot of the toys developed that are coded specifically for the female gender, for women, or I should say for women, for little girls, focus on domestic activities, on child rearing and stuff like that. And one of the consequences of this in terms of then things like school and how we talk about gender roles and division of labor is that we don't see a lot of women and people of color entering and pursuing careers in STEM, right? So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, right? And I'll talk about this article at the end, but Grogan talks about how there is a gender bias in science. And I think it's really important to talk about because many of you are coming from the Faculty of Science or Faculty of Arts and Science, but from a BSc or from science programming. And you may think that science is neutral. But I think what our previous look at the fairy tale, right, of the egg and the sperm has shown us is that scientists are not neutral, right? Scientists are not free of bias, and science is also political. So we have to consider then how this impacts it, right? And what Grogan is essentially getting at is that we have a leaky pipeline that exists in STEM, whereby while initially we may see, such as an undergraduate programming, a high frequency of women enrolled in those courses, what we see is a disproportionate amount of women then teaching STEM, right? So representation basically sucks on that side. And so the question is why? Why do we have this atrophy from kind of gender equity or almost a gender imbalance in some regards in undergrad, where we have a significant number of women in science to very few actually, what we might say, doing the science at these higher levels, right? And so again, if we want to understand why inequality exists, we have to understand the structures that are used and the systems that are in place and the institutions that reinforce these things, right? And probably one of the most important things that has shaped gender inequity and gender inequality in our world today is colonialism. So here's just a brief definition of what colonialism looks like. And a good example of colonialism and how it impacts gender in particular, and again, if we take an intersectional approach where we start to consider ethnicity as well, is the very fact that we had so many missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls here in Canada is because our colonial government made those individuals invisible, right? That basically explained away their absence and devalued them and dehumanized women, Indigenous women and girls to such a degree that, again, the larger society, right, was not recognizing that this was a problem. And it wasn't until there was calls for justice, right, that there was calls for attention, that people started to pay attention. And I should say non-Indigenous people started to pay attention and government officials started to pay attention, that we recognized and realized that, our Indigenous women and girls have been disproportionately impacted by violence, and that this is something that needs to be addressed. So initially when anthropologists were looking at inequality, and I don't want to go into this too much, they focused on basically things like first identifying if equality existed within the society they're studying, but then also to what degrees inequality existed. And then this then led to definitions or classifications of society that were based on this, right? And note that we're talking really about power here, right? And how power, which we talked about in a previous topic, generates inequality, right? And also is the product of inequality in our society as well. But these terms and these classifications that resulted were problematic because they were being derived by anthropologists who are settlers, right? Who are part of, who are descendants and products of colonialism, right? So basically a lot of white folk coming in and defining these groups from the perspective of their power, right? So having high status and prestige, for example, that I also have, not only as a white person, but as a professor and as an academic, right? Another approach was to examine where this inequality plays out in the lived experience of individuals. So rather than looking at large group perspectives, starting to look at the division of labor in particular. And this led to what was called often a dichotomy of the public and the domestic. But the problem with this dichotomy is that the reality is that this dichotomy that was built led to stereotypes that don't actually reflect, again, the lived experiences of people. So first and foremost, this dichotomy contributed to ideas that we have this pervasive asymmetry between the sexes, and it also started to then highlight male activities as important, right? So they were kind of centered in these narratives. And women then were kind of associated with more of a domestic orientation education were linked with mother-child groups. And so this is why we see then the focus so much on anthropological literature on women as mothers, right? And so we've already looked at how this is inherently problematic because not all women are mothers. We've looked at how maternal instinct is not inherently biologically present in all females, right? So we have to consider basically, why do we have then these stereotypes? Well, a lot of it was coming out of research that was shaping the experiences of women as only situated in these fields, right? But with the rise of feminism, and particularly feminist anthropologists, what we start to see is more critical examinations of this dichotomy. So is this actually fact? Is this actually true? Or are we looking at stereotypes that are coming out of basically our own cultural perspective? So we have Raina Rapp, who wrote about how women and men both use public spaces, but just use it differently, right? And so again, this makes sense if we start to think about it. The university is a public space. We have men and women and non-binary individuals and transgendered individuals. We have all these different genders that are present in a public space, but what Rapp basically called out was the idea that, hey, they're using them differently, right? So maybe we should just look at this. And same with domestic spaces. Well, what do domestic spaces look like? But also then Yegan Asako came along and said, well, listen, we can think of this as kind of a functional metaphor, that this idea of dividing spaces into public spaces versus domestic spaces or private spaces kind of makes sense initially. The problem is that they don't really lend themselves to having firm, well-defined boundaries, right? That even within domestic spaces, so let's think within a household itself, we can have both private and public spaces, right? So our bedrooms often are private spaces, right? Think about where you have company in pre-COVID days where we could have people over, right? Whereas living room spaces are more public spaces in which we will welcome people into our homes and they can experience our homes, or yards as well, right? So this idea of that there's these fixed places that are either domestic or public or private or personal is problematic, because that's simply just not how we operate in spaces. And often our ability to transform spaces from public into private or vice versa reflects a lot more about gender expectations and gender role and stuff than a kind of hard lines of saying, well, no, inherently all households are private spaces, right? And think about this, maybe a more clear example would be of this idea of how public versus domestic can be blended, is many of us are working from home. So is the kitchen table that I'm currently recording this lecture at a domestic space because it's within my household, or is it a public space because it is now a recording studio by which I broadcast my course materials, or when we have our collaborate sessions that I'm from home and working from home, right? So this idea of working from home is transforming our idea of what is domestic, what is private, again, what is public, what is private. Me not having cameras or forcing you to have cameras on is part of my recognition that where you're learning might need to be a private space, even if you're in public, or vice versa. If you're in a domestic space, maybe there's an increased need for security because you don't want to be welcoming the class into your private space and you have the right to privacy, right? So basically it was thanks to these early feminist anthropologists who brought in these ideas and started to challenge these traditional notions, right? So again, as I mentioned here, that basically what cross-cultural studies, what ethnology have shown us is that the association of women with a private domain and men exclusively with a public domain is too simply simplistic, that most spaces serve simultaneous roles, right? And this is where I'd say anthropologically, more broadly, this is the good stuff, right? This is where anthropology is at its best, where we can then examine these simultaneous roles and expect to, or try to tease out some of the nuances that exist. Okay, so another way that we've approached a gender and inequality is to look at the division of labor. So here's some background on modes of subsistence, and that leads us into our readings for this week, where, again, I wanted to show you some differences and some variations even within, when communities may have some similar means of procuring the resources that they need in order to survive, which we broadly call subsistence practices. how it plays out in terms of gender can vary significantly cross-culturally. So I wanted to give us one example. So the Etzioko, Griffin, and Griffin reading, where we're looking at foraging, so people who do hunting and collecting of plant resources, and then compare and contrast it with horticulturalists who have still have and retain or not, I shouldn't say retain, but still have a foraging component, including things like fishing, which is a critical form of hunting. But also then there's this gardening component as well. And so in Blackboard in Collaborate this week, we'll talk a little bit about comparing and contrasting these readings and some of the lessons they tell us about how egalitarianism plays out in these two communities, that we can make arguments that they are both egalitarian, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is equal in terms of how labor is divided, the roles they perform. And then we'll talk a little bit about how age actually becomes really critical in terms of the roles that that people play. In terms of economics, I wanted to talk about this. Again, this realms a bit more into the realm of sociology and political sciences and economics, but I think it's very important that anthropologists pay attention and contribute to these discussions as well. And it's that of the gender gap. So you might have heard a lot of talk about this, I think, especially in the context of COVID, about inequitable distribution of labor, not just within households, but also how we are compensated for the labor that we perform. And so I posted this link. Again, I realize it's from a few years ago, but my understanding is data today continues to show basically a very similar pattern where based on, if we look at or attempt to measure the gender gap, one of the ways we can do it is looking at full-time, full-year wages. And in Canada, what it's been demonstrated, and this has been fairly consistent for, again, a significant period of time, that women earn a substantial less than their male counterparts for equal work. So we have, for example, two professors, right? So myself and my male colleague, what they found is that on average, that female professors earn 77% of what male professors make, right? So one of the questions we then have as anthropologists is why does this exist? But it's also important to note, again, from an intersectional perspective, that if we simply only look at gender, we're missing the big picture. And there's a lot of discussion around this during the American election, the recent U.S. election in particular, that it's not that all women in Canada earn 77 cents on the dollar that men make, but that applies specifically to women, because when we start to look at BIPOC individuals, so Black, Indigenous people of color, what we find is they make even less. And so I have a couple of infographics here from a couple of different sources. So one is from the United States and one's from Canada, I believe. And so if we look on the left, for example, we'll see that, Asian women actually make a little bit more. Again, how these terms are defined is usually based on census data. White women, 79%, Black women, 63%, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander women, 63%, American Indian or Alaskan Native women, so First Nations or Indigenous people, are women, 60%, and then Hispanic women make 55% of what a white male in the same position would make, right? So what are some of the explanations for this? Well, let's talk about this in class. And you'll notice that while the numbers and percentages may vary cross-culturally, the reality is that globally speaking, a gender wage gap does exist where on average, women make less than men. So let's think about then how the roles that other institutions play, particularly let's think about things like the state and how they shape then gender inequity within cultures as well. So again, some definitions for you relating to the state and globalization. Again, linking back in, if we look at Canadian politics, we have to recognize and address the ongoing legacy of colonialism, right, which has contributed significantly to, again, a monopoly of Canadian politics by white affluent males. And again, this is not just the product of colonialism, but other gender-based social forces that have also kept women subordinate to men, right? And it's not just that we see an underrepresentation of women, but also of people of color. But while we see a shift, there continues to be significant barriers to participation. And I think it's really important to talk about this. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and collaborate this week, because we have a civic election coming up. So here in the city of Edmonton, I know we're a couple of years out from a provincial election, but that's coming, and there's a lot of talk about an upcoming federal election as well. So we have to think about, why do we not see women, and in particular minority women, participating in politics here in Canada? And so I just wanted to show you, again, this idea of representation and why it's important, and also highlight that this is not just a Canadian issue. So this was a recent thread that was posted on social media showing what happens when we remove men from political photos, right? So on the left is this is the original photograph, and then on the right, this is where the men have been removed. Again, on the left, and you can see a lot of these come from American politics, right? So here's Obama when he was president here. Again, here's another one. Again, we remove the men, a single woman in a room full of men. Again, look at, again, ethnicities that are present here. Again, it's important for us to take this intersectional approach that, it's not just that women are the minorities here, but also other forms of visible minority are invisible here as well, are very lacking in here, poorly represented in here. And this includes not just ethnicity, but think about abilities as well. A lot of able-bodied individuals. Think about the age that's represented here, right? So who's not at the table? I love this one. So these are heads of state. So this is more of a global perspective, and you can see three out of a room full of men. So a bit more better representation in terms of ethnicity, but still gender equity is not here. This is from the British Parliament. Again, you can see very few women represented. So why does this exist? Well, there's been a couple of models that have been proposed to explain why we see this inequity. The first one is the similarity model that basically argues that in theory, right, and then basically this model doesn't work because, as we'll talk about, that it says that basically that women who seek political office have to possess the same social and political resources that men do, right? And so in a similarity model, the idea is that as long as those women meet and present the same way as men do, then they will therefore have the same opportunities. And this is definitely true for white women, right? So if we think about women in political offices, right, that the idea is that as long as they have the right education, the right class, often the right ethnicity, then they can achieve political office, right? And I think the election where Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump is a good example how sometimes it still isn't enough, right? So basically what the compensation model argues is that in many cases it is not simply enough for women to have the same opportunities as a male and therefore can obtain those, but rather, and this applies disproportionately true for minority women, is that they must surpass the standards set by majority men and women, right? So it's you might have seen these models around equity where it shows a guy running towards a finish line and then a gal running towards the finish line, and the guy is like, what are you complaining about? We're running the exact same length of race, right? It's like a 100-meter dash, but the woman has like a ball and chain around her ankles, and there's like a shark-infested pit in front of her, and there's like fires and barbed wire and all of these barriers that she has to go through, right? And so that's what the compensation model argues, is that minority women in particular have to exceed the groups they are competing with, because basically, again, these institutional barriers, these negative stereotypes exist that make it that much more difficult for them, right? So they have to first, not only, and I mean, I guess, Barack Obama is a great example of a minority male. It wasn't sufficient enough for him to be, to meet the exceptional requirements. Well, that's debatable, to meet the basic bare minimum requirements to be a president of the United States, but he had to exceed them, right? He had to be an exceptional Black man in order to achieve the rank of president of the United States. And there's been a lot of talk about his wife, Michelle Obama, how the same thing, how she was more heavily critiqued than any other first lady in U.S. history simply because of the color of her skin, right? That, the fact that she was highly educated even wasn't enough, right? She was still expected to do more and to be more. Um, Again, if we return back to Canadian politics, we can again talk about this a little bit more in Blackboard. So when Trudeau was first elected PM and then split his cabinet, when he split his cabinet, he did so intentionally in order to meet gender equity, and it actually received a lot of critique. And I think what's important about here is one of the interesting responses to the critique, which points out again this kind of again compensation model that says, what's often a common refrain, and this is often a barrier to women participating in politics, is that they're constantly challenged on their qualifications. And this is something that I've experienced as a professor as well, that it's not sufficient for me to have a PhD, for me to get the title of doctor, but I consistently and repeatedly have to ask to be referred to it, that there's an assumption that somehow or a stereotype somehow, I don't know what it is, but somehow I am less than, by virtue of my gender, than my male counterparts, right? That we never ask, or we very rarely ask, what are his qualifications, but we almost always ask, what are hers? What makes her an expert? And again, this is really illustrated by this, that when Freeland was initially appointed as Canada's first female finance minister, there was a lot of clapback in the media where people were like, well, she doesn't have the right experience, right? It wasn't that she didn't have the right experience. She didn't have the right qualifications. And people were very critical of her background. And it was rightfully pointed out that, well, no one's really ever been, at least as publicly critical about this before. I mean, sure, in political science circles, this kind of debate happens all the time. But again, the minute you put a woman in these roles, the critique becomes ever that more kind of fine-grained, right? It's not enough to have a degree, but she doesn't have a finance degree. So all of a sudden that's not sufficient. And the reality is that one of the other barriers that exists is not only do women then have to, exceed, not only meet, or in the case of white women meet, but then in the case of minority women exceed the expectations and the standards that are set for their white male counterparts, but they're also then subject to greater harassment. So it's not simply scrutiny, but harassment. And there was a lot of coverage about this, again, in relation to the 2020 US election, right, with AOC. There's been a lot of talk about this in Canadian politics, particularly here in Alberta. Rachel Notley, when she was our premier, received, and Alison Redford as well. So it shows that it's not just party lines, that basically women are threatened when they are successful in politics, regardless of which party they ran for. So you can see that both Alison Redford and Rachel Notley received almost equivalent numbers of threats, but note that Rachel Notley exceeded Alison Redford's total number of threats in 1 year, whereas Redford had there were 3. So political lines actually still do matter, and party lines still do matter. But the reality is that women in politics are subject to much greater, again, not scrutiny, but also harassment. And we see this not just at the provincial level, but in city politics all the way up through federal politics as well. So I did mention this briefly, that I've experienced some forms of inequity as a female academic. One of the ways that we see this, and it's been studied quite a bit in the last few years, and I mention this again, not because I'm calling students out, but rather what this demonstrates is that we have a form of implicit bias, right? We have an idea in our head of what or who a professor is, or what or who a politician is, or a president is, right? And these stereotypes that we have often also include gender. But it also shapes the ways that we talk about and think about people who perform these roles as well. And that's what Ottoboni et al. Study is getting at, is that not only are female professors held to a higher standard and are subject to greater harassment than their male counterparts, but even when we're praised, the words that are used to talk about us is very different from our male counterparts. And because of this, this often holds back female professors from getting higher academic appointments, from getting promotion, or from even getting employed in the first place. Because what hiring committees look for is things like teaching excellence, research excellence. So if you say, oh, my professor is an expert in his field, and then you say, but Dr. Biittner is really kind and empathetic, who is a job committee going to hire? Well, they're going to say, oh, that's great that Biittner's nice, but we need an expert, right? So they're going to automatically, even if we have the same credentials based on student evaluations, now the bar at which we're being measured shifts, right? And so this Audubon et al., I talk about it, and we can talk about this in class this week a bit more about how they tested this bias. Basically what they had was they had the same person teach a course, but because it was an online course, they had them present as either a male individual or as a female individual. And note that this bias, this double standard actually gets exponentially worse when we start to consider BIPOC individuals, so minority professors, that basically being a minority female professor in academia is incredibly challenging, is incredibly difficult, that the standard you're held to is exceptionally higher than any other faculty member you would see as a result of this. And we can imagine, if we can take this intersectional approach, if we start to think about other ways that minority status may be present. So we can think about things like ability or disability. We can think about how that may shape perceptions of the competency and the quality of instruction that's being received, or of the instructor themselves. We can think about things like invisible minorities, so things like sexual minorities, queer instructors are, although I don't have a good study for this, but I just know anecdotally, if they identify as visibly queer, that this can be disadvantageous to them. So many individuals do not disclose, of course, their status as a sexuality minority. Others do to dress it. We know that being a parent disproportionately benefits male professors instead of female professors. So we can talk a little bit more about why that happens. But basically, what we know is that actually that student evaluations, while we still insist on you doing them, and yes, the time period's coming up where I'm going to kindly ask that you do fill it out for this course, but do also, and not just this course, but all of your courses, just take a few minutes to answer the questions. It is important. Again, it is used for things like promotion. But think about how your own implicit forms of bias may impact what you say, right? So if you took this course because you thought, hey, it's Anthropology 110, it's an introductory level course, it sounds pretty easy, but you're not getting a grade that correlates to your understanding of what an easy course is, or if it's more work than you expected it to be for a 100-level course, that those expectations you have are going to shape then how you evaluate me and your other instructors, right? And so what happens is that instructors that can then be measured as more effective through other methods of evaluating that aren't based on student evaluations often get lower ratings, or can get lower ratings than less effective instructors. And again, they test this by doing the blind testing that, if, for example, basically the instructor, it was all the same instructor, but the instructor that students thought was a female instructor was consistently rated as lower in terms of the quality of feedback they given, and as slower in terms of when they got the grades back, even though it was the same instructor marking all of the exams, giving all of the feedback, and every single student got their assignment back on the exact same day. So again, it was just this perception that students had that, oh, she took too long to get the marks back, even though it was the same person. Okay. So again, what I'm saying is that just be aware that the reason why we may not see so many minority professors, female professors, has a lot to do with how we're evaluated, right? That we're automatically less likely to be appointed to positions or receive promotions because we're also more likely to receive lower scores on their teaching evaluations, right? And some of it, this, for example, talks about a language bias, and we'll revisit this towards the end of the term when we look at this, that sessional instructors, female sessional instructors, for example, their attractiveness or their perceived attractiveness often had a lot to do with how well they did. So the more attractive a professor is perceived as being if they're female, the more likely they are to receive higher ratings. And this also, so I want you to think about then, again, I'm not calling you out as individuals, but just thinking about students in general. And I mean, I was probably subject to this as well. I was once a student too, but just think about what your biases are when you're doing those evaluations, and think about effectiveness versus expectations. Think about the language you used, right? Again, female instructors are often described as helpful. Male instructors are often told to be or are often framed to be knowledgeable, and then this then shapes again, things like opportunity to serve on committees or get promotions, et cetera, et cetera. But also importantly, the reason why I also want to talk about this is that the scientific literature on this has actually shown that the gender bias also disproportionately impacts female students as well. So for example, the more attractive you are perceived as being, the more likely you are to get into a university. And this applies in the United States where they actually have photographs as part of the application, which is gross. But also you're more likely to get higher grades from your instructors as well, right? So this means that we have gender and then other forms of bias, including racial bias, that are disproportionately impacting who goes to universities, right? So again, this similarity model, I think, well, if we all have the same GPA, then everyone who meets that GPA can then get into university. But the reality is that a gender and race bias kicks in that can prevent individuals from getting into university, even though in theory they've checked off all the boxes appropriately. Often, again, racialized students and female students need to outperform their white male counterparts in order to get positions in things like graduate school, which again will then also contribute to the disproportionate representation in the professors, right? Because you need to go to grad school to become a professor, and if you can't get into grad school, then you're not going to be able to become a professor, right? So all of these forms of bias then could create the system of inequity that we currently see in academia. So this brings us back to what I talked about, the leaky pipeline that Grogan talks about in their article, right? Where basically that women, it can start with even women less likely being employed as graduate students or researchers in labs. They're also less likely to get recommended as excellent. And we can see how gender bias might play out, that the terminology used to describe their proficiency and competency in a lab environment, right? If they're like, oh, they're team players and they're helpful, versus knowledgeable, skilled experts in performing these tasks, you can see, well, do I want someone who's helpful, or do I want someone who knows what they're doing when I'm hiring, right? This then impacts things like how grants are distributed and the ability to do research. This impacts then things like publication, which then again contributes then to basically very low percentages of minority women, of women overall in higher academia. Okay, so a lot to process this week, a lot for us to talk about. I look forward to our discussion, even though I know you have your midterm, but I'll see you on Thursday.